I watched 400 species place their wagers on how quickly the human would die. The Krill commander smirked, the methane ambassador scoffed, and the arena's statistics promised dismemberment in 45 seconds. Then she walked in, calm, bored, folding her jacket like it was laundry day. That's when I knew the galaxy's understanding of humanity was about to shatter. The amphitheater hummed with the low-frequency clicks and guttural murmurs of 400 species crammed into tiered seating, all leaning forward in shared anticipation. I watched the odds display projected above the arena flicker. 45.2 seconds, then 44.8, fluctuating in cold, precise digits. Commander Vexnar stood at the commander's rail, his 6 arms crossed in a posture I'd come to recognize as pure, unshakable arrogance. Next to him, the methane ambassador exhaled a cloud of noxious gas as he placed another wager, the gesture dripping with contempt. Below, the arena floor was a scarred metal plane crisscrossed with deep gouges. Some were fresh, gleaming under the harsh overhead lumens, but others were faint, almost polished away by time and repeated violence. They were like ghost signatures, the last marks left by beings who had lasted less than a minute. The statistical feed running along the base of the viewport didn't bother with names or species, just numbers. 45-second average dismemberment, 100% fatality rate. No exceptions. You could smell it in the recycled air, the charged, almost electric scent of alien excitement, a mix of pheromones and eager respiration. There was no sympathy here, no curiosity about the outcome. Every being in that room, from the 6-eyed traders in the cheap seats to the diplomatic corps in the front rows, knew exactly how this worked. They'd seen it before. They'd cheered before. This wasn't sport. It was ritual. My datapad was open, recording the shift in the betting pools. Wagers weren't on if she'd die, but how quickly. The numbers kept ticking downward, sub 45, then sub 40. The collective certainty was a physical weight in the room. I noted the ambassador's latest bet, 38 seconds. He looked pleased. Then the human entrance door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. The amphitheater fell utterly silent. Not a click, not a murmur, not even the rustle of carapace or scale. 400 species holding their breath at once. Her footsteps echoed. That was the thing. They echoed. Clear, measured, unhurried impacts of boot soles on metal, ringing out in the sudden quiet. They were the steps of someone walking down a corridor, not into an execution chamber. There was no panic in the rhythm, no stutter or haste, just a calm, even pace that seemed all wrong for this place, for this moment. The tension in the room twisted, pivoting from bloodlust to something else, something like confusion. The displays kept counting down from 45, but nobody was watching them anymore. All eyes were on the woman who walked like she had all the time in the world. Lieutenant Commander Martinez didn't scan for threats or adopt a fighting stance. Her first movement wasn't defensive, it was domestic. She had the air of someone who just arrived late to a staff briefing, mildly annoyed but entirely unconcerned by the audience. The 3 juvenile krill predators kept circling the perimeter, their claws making that awful scraping sound against the metal floor that usually signaled imminent violence. They were coiled springs of muscle and instinct waiting for the signal. She paid them no mind at all. Instead, her attention went to the Terran Coalition jacket she wore. She unzipped it with a smooth, practiced motion, treating the material like it was something far more delicate than standard-issue military wear. The fabric wasn't armor, it wouldn't stop a claw or a tooth. But she handled it with a kind of reverence you just don't see in an execution arena. She slid it off her shoulders without hurry, without a single rushed gesture. Then she began to fold it, methodically, precisely. She aligned the sleeves so the seams matched perfectly, smoothed the front panels, and squared the corners like she was preparing it for inspection. The entire amphitheater watched, utterly baffled. This was a place for blood and screaming, not for garment care. The crowd's low murmur shifted tone, from eager bloodlust to confused whispering. You could feel the spectacle's rhythm breaking down. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't how prey behaved. She found a clean patch of flooring, no scratches, no stains, and set the folded jacket down gently. She even gave it a final pat, like she was reassuring a child before leaving the room. The gesture was so ordinary, so completely out of place that it seemed to suck the air out of the chamber. 400 species held a collective breath, trying to process this breach of arena protocol. Death sport doesn't include tidying up before the main event. Only then did she look up. Not at the circling predators, not at the crowd. Her eyes went straight to Commander Vexnar at his observation rail, and she smiled. It wasn't a baring of teeth or a challenge. It was calm, almost pleasant, but it carried more quiet threat than any snarl I'd ever seen from a dozen predator species. It was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't, something you really ought to know. That's when the smallest cub broke. The discipline, the training, the circling pattern, it all shattered. It lunged forward without the signal, without coordination with its siblings. Pure impulse. Claws out, body coiled for a killing pounce. The motion was fast, a blur of aggressive instinct, but it was premature, undisciplined. And in that moment, the entire dynamic of the arena shifted. The controlled hunt was over. Something else had begun. The smallest predator launched with the accelerated pounce technique that had made its species so feared across 3 sectors. It moved like liquid death, a blur of coordinated muscle and instinct, claws extended precisely for throat removal. The betting monitors flickered violently as spectators leaned forward, credits shifting in real time toward shorter and shorter survival windows. I saw the methane ambassador's tendrils twitch with what I recognized as financial anticipation. They all expected the spray of arterial blood, the quick, brutal end they'd paid to see. Jessica's response wasn't evasion. She didn't jump back or flinch. She made one minimal movement, a sidestep so slight it seemed almost careless. Her hands came up not to strike, but to meet the cub's forelimbs. She didn't try to stop its momentum. She guided it, added a slight vector change to its trajectory. It was like watching an engineer recalibrate a faulty thruster with a single finger tap. Physics did the work. The cub's own kinetic energy, built up for a killing leap, converted instantly into impact force against the arena's reinforced plating. The sound wasn't the scream or crunch the crowd expected. It was a dull, almost hollow thud of organic material meeting unyielding metal, the kind of sound you hear when something heavy and alive hits a wall at speed. The cub slid down the wall and landed in an ungainly heap. It shook its head, its sensory horns vibrating with clear disorientation. It wasn't seriously injured. The krill are built to withstand impacts, but its confidence was gone. That absolute bred-for-generation certainty that its pounce meant instant death had just been proven wrong. It looked confused, like its own body had betrayed it. Up on the main display, the statistic feed flickered. The 45-second counter was still running, its numbers blinking steadily downward. But for the first time, the predicted outcome beside it, the guaranteed fatality marker, stuttered. It didn't change, not yet. But it hesitated. That was new. I'd never seen it do that before. The system's algorithms were processing an input they had no precedent for. A predator had attacked and the prey was still standing, untouched. The silence in the amphitheater broke, not with cheers but with a low, uneasy murmur. The rhythm of the spectacle had been fractured. That's when the other 2 predators moved. The premature attack of their sibling had broken their formation, but their training took over. They didn't charge wildly. They shifted into a coordinated pincer movement, instinctively flanking Jessica from front and rear. Their body language was different now. Less like play, more like business. The playtime was over. The smallest cub's failure had switched them from hunting mode to something more serious. Their claws scraped the floor again, but the sound was sharper, more intentional. They were closing in, and this time there would be no single simple charge. They were going to work together. The 2 remaining cubs attacked in perfect unison, a textbook pincer maneuver born from generations of instinct and training. The alpha came from the front, claws extended for her face and torso, while the beta closed from behind, aiming for the spine and legs. The crowd's roar was immediate, a wave of approval crashing through the amphitheater. This was what they'd paid to see. Overwhelming force, certain victory, the kind of coordinated attack that left no room for evasion or survival. The statistical display flashed a new, even lower survival estimate. The ambassador's wager looked solid. Instead of trying to defend against both, Jessica went down. She dropped straight to her back on the cold metal floor. A move that looked for all the galaxy like surrender. It was an invitation. The alpha, committed to its forward lunge, saw the opening and took it, its body descending upon her with the full intent to pin and eviscerate. Its weight, easily 3 times hers, was meant to be the end of the fight. But her legs didn't go limp. They coiled beneath the descending mass, knees bent, feet planted flat. They weren't yielding. They were loading, As the predator came down, her hips pivoted with a mechanical precision that was jarring to watch. It wasn't a wild thrash or a struggle. It was pure technique. She didn't try to catch its weight. She redirected it. Using the cub's own mass and momentum against it, she altered its trajectory in midair. It was a fulcrum action, a brutal lesson in applied physics that required almost no energy output from her. The throw wasn't dramatic or showy. It was efficient. The Alpha went from being on top of her to being hurled sideways. Its own power amplified and turned back on itself. It crashed into the arena floor with a concussive force that was utterly out of proportion to the size of the combatants. The impact was a deep resonant boom that vibrated up through the tiered seating. A physical tremor I felt through the soles of my boots. The sound was wrong. It was the sound of something fundamental breaking. I looked down. The arena flooring, a composite alloy designed to withstand direct hits from plasma artillery and recharge between matches, had cracked. A web of fractures radiated out from the point of impact, a spiderweb of failure in a surface that was supposed to be indestructible. It was a silent, profound rebuttal to every assumption in the room. The roar of the crowd died instantly, cut off as if someone had severed a vocal cord. The silence that followed was absolute, thick with disbelief. 400 species stared, processing the impossible. The alpha cub lay stunned, struggling to push itself up from the cracked surface. That's when the second cub, the beta, hesitated. It had been milliseconds from sinking its claws into her back, but it stopped. Its attack rhythm shattered. It stood there confused, its head cocked, processing the sudden, violent defeat of its larger sibling. That pause lasted only 0.3 seconds according to my later analysis of the footage. But in combat time, in that arena, it was an eternity. It was the first crack in their predatory certainty, and in that tiny window of hesitation, the entire dynamic of the fight shifted irrevocably. The initiative was no longer theirs. She was already moving. With the alpha cub still struggling to rise from the cracked flooring, the second predator saw its opening. It went straight for her exposed torso while she was still on the ground, claws extended toward what should have been soft, vulnerable human tissue. Every species in that amphitheater knew the krill offensive strategy: target the center mass, tear through organs, induce rapid system shock. It was a move that had ended thousands of fights. The tension in the room sharpened again. This was supposed to be the finishing blow. Jessica's response wasn't a block or a desperate roll. It was a single sharp upward drive of her right elbow. The strike wasn't aimed at the cub's armored head plating or its thick neck muscles. It went precisely for the throat, targeting the vulnerable cartilage and nerve clusters right below the jaw. It was surgical in its accuracy. The impact wasn't loud, but the effect was immediate and deeply unsettling. The cub didn't roar in pain. It recoiled violently. Its forward momentum instantly reversed. A choked, gurgling sound escaped it. A wet, involuntary spasm that was completely alien coming from a krill predator. Its claws, moments from tearing into her, snapped back to its own throat as its body was racked by a gag reflex. This wasn't damage-based combat. She hadn't tried to break its neck or crush its windpipe. She had triggered a fundamental hardwired biological response. Predators aren't supposed to experience discomfort. Their biology is optimized for delivering violence, not receiving it in a way that causes this kind of systemic confusion. Its attack rhythm shattered completely. The predator stood there hunched over, shaking its head, making these awful retching noises. It was a display of pure neurological disruption. The crowd watched, silent and horrified, as a being bred for millennia to be the pinnacle of predatory evolution experienced something as basic and undignified as choking. It was a profound violation of the natural order as they understood it. This creature, designed to inflict terror, was now visibly, audibly distressed. For the first time in its life, it was on the receiving end of a sensation it had no evolutionary framework to process. The spectacle had become a dissection. She wasn't just fighting them. She was demonstrating their weaknesses to a galactic audience. The energy in the amphitheater had shifted from bloodlust to a kind of clinical, horrified fascination. That's when the third cub, the one she'd thrown into the wall at the start, finally reoriented itself. Its attack came moments later, but it was different now. There was no coordinated strategy left, no pincer movement. Its siblings were down or disabled. This was a lone, desperate charge born of confusion and fading instinct. It came at her head-on, a straightforward lunge. Its snout met her boot in a perfectly timed intercepting kick. She didn't swing her leg for power. She simply lifted her foot and placed it with decisive force into the center of its charging face. The connection was clean, a sharp impact of reinforced boot against bone and cartilage. The sound was distinctly organic, a crack that was more felt than heard across the silent observation deck. The cub stumbled backward, shaking its head in a daze, a low whine of pain and confusion replacing its aggressive clicks. The fight, for all practical purposes, was over. The predators were still standing, but their will to fight was broken. They were hurt, confused, and leaderless. The 45-second timer on the display finally hit 0 and began to blink, a silent, mocking condemnation of every wager placed in the room. The guaranteed outcome had not come to pass. The final cub attacked with a distinct lack of coordination, its pack strategy shattered by what it had just witnessed. The crowd leaned forward, fully expecting her to finish it the way every other species would, with maximum brutal force. A killing blow, a final definitive end. That's what the arena was for. That's what they understood. The tension was a palpable thing, a collective breath held in 400 different sets of lungs. Instead, her kick was measured. It wasn't about power. It was about precision. She didn't put her full body into it. She simply lifted her leg and met the charge with a calibrated impact. Her boot connected with the cub's snout with a force that was sufficient but not maximal. The sound was distinctly organic, a crisp, wet crack of cartilage and bone yielding under the precise, focused impact. It was the sound of something breaking, but not fatally. It was the sound of a lesson being delivered. The cub stumbled backward, its charge completely halted. It shook its head violently, a low, pained whine escaping its throat. The aggressive clicking stopped, replaced by this new, confused vocalization. Its claws, which had been extended for attack, now hung limply at its sides. For the first time since the fight began, the predators showed something that went beyond aggression or instinct. They showed hesitation, a dawning unfamiliar uncertainty. Their body language shifted entirely. The offensive postures, the lowered heads, the tensed muscles, the bared teeth all melted away. The alpha cub was still trying to rise from the cracked floor, but its movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. The second cub was still recovering from the gag reflex, its head hung low. And the third cub, the one she had just kicked, was now backing away slowly, its eyes fixed on her, its body coiled not for attack but for defense. They were assessing her, not as prey but as a threat. The entire dynamic of predator and prey had been inverted in the span of less than a minute. Up on the main display, the 45-second timer hit 0. The numbers flashed red for a moment, then reset themselves. It was just a piece of software, an algorithm performing its function. But in that silent amphitheater, its blinking digits felt like an accusation. The guaranteed fatality statistic had not come to pass. All 3 cubs were still functional, bruised, cracked, and psychologically defeated, but alive. They were no longer a hunting pack. They were 3 individuals who had just had their entire worldview violently rewritten. The absolute silence that had gripped the spectators was a heavier weight than the earlier roar of the crowd. You could feel the collective cognitive dissonance, the struggle to process a scene that broke every known rule of the arena. It was the quiet of a paradigm shifting. That's when the Predator Elder's voice ripped through the silence. It was a raw, guttural roar that echoed off the metal walls, a sound of pure, undiluted fury mixed with an arrogance that was suddenly, painfully outdated. He stood at the observation rail, his massive frame trembling with rage, and bellowed the words that had always been true, that were supposed to always be true. "The Cubs will tear her apart." It was a declaration from a different era, a statement of fact that had just been rendered a historical artifact. He was still living in the world of 5 minutes ago, a world where humans were weak, where prey died, and where krill supremacy was a law of nature. His certainty in that moment was the loudest, most tragic thing in the room. The Predator Elder's roar tore through the silence of the amphitheater like a sound from another age. It was a raw, guttural declaration that belonged to a time before humanity had ever stepped into the galactic arena, a statement of absolute certainty that had, until this moment, been as reliable as gravity. He stood rigid at the observation rail, his massive frame tensed with the weight of generations of inherited dominance. His authority wasn't just his own, it was the accumulated arrogance of his entire species. "The Cubs will tear her apart." The words weren't a prediction. They were a law of nature being stated as fact. It was the last desperate gasp of a worldview that was already dead, its echo hanging in the air, pathetic and outdated. Jessica didn't even look at him. She didn't shout back, didn't issue a challenge. Her response was more powerful because it was silent. She simply began to move. It wasn't a charge or an attack. It was a slow, deliberate advance toward the three cubs who were now regrouping in the center of the arena. Shaking off their injuries and confusion, her posture was completely relaxed. Her hands weren't clenched into fists. They were open, held loosely at her sides. There was no aggression in her body language, only a calm, unsettling purpose. She walked toward them like someone approaching skittish animals, not like a combatant facing down engineered killers. The cubs didn't attack. They backed away. They maintained a careful distance from her, their movements hesitant and unsure. Their low, aggressive clicks and growls had vanished. In their place was a new sound, a series of rapid, uncertain chittering noises. It was the vocalization of confusion, of reassessment. They were communicating with each other, but the message was no longer about the hunt. It was about the threat standing before them. The elder's shouted command, his absolute certainty, collided directly with the observable reality in the arena. His words said one thing, their eyes, their bodies, their new fearful sounds said another, and in that moment, reality won. For the first time in recorded krill history, predator cubs showed fear of what they were supposed to see as prey. It was a complete inversion of their biological programming. Their bodies were coiled not for the pounce but for the flinch. Their heads were lowered not in aggression but in a nascent, unfamiliar submission. They were looking at her not as food, but as the apex being in the room. The spectacle was over. The lesson was being written in real time, and every species present was bearing witness. The silence in the amphitheater was no longer just shock. It was the sound of a fundamental galactic truth being rewritten. That's when Jessica spoke. She turned her head slowly, not toward the cowering cubs, but to address the entire assembly, her voice cutting through the thick silence with a clarity that required no amplification. It wasn't loud, but it carried to every tier, every seat. It was the first time she had used her voice since entering the arena, and she used it not for a battle cry but for a statement. Her tone was even matter-of-fact, devoid of anger or pride. It was the voice of someone stating the obvious to a room full of people who had somehow missed it. The elder's roar had been the last gasp of the old way. Her first words were the quiet, undeniable beginning of the new. Her voice didn't need to be loud. It carried across the amphitheater with a clarity that cut through the thick silence, further and with more impact than any scream could have managed. She turned her head, her gaze locking not on the confused cubs but directly on Commander Vexnar at his observation post. She ignored the predators completely, treating them as an afterthought. The tension in the room was a live wire, humming with the weight of her next words. You could feel 400 species straining to hear. We did not get to the top of our food chain by being the biggest or strongest, she said. Her tone was flat, factual. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple correction of a profound galactic misunderstanding. She explained it like she was reading from a manual. Humanity's rise wasn't a story of overwhelming power. It was a saga of persistence, millennia of adaptation, of being the creature that out-endured, out-thought, and out-learned every other competitor on a planet that was actively trying to kill them. Survival wasn't a trait. It was a strategy they had honed through constant, brutal necessity. She explained that every Terran Coalition officer learns multiple combat systems, not because they're naturally superior warriors, but because their history taught them that specialization is a death sentence. You can't afford to have just one tool when your environment, or your enemy, can change in a heartbeat. It's a doctrine born from desperation, not dominance. Then came the revelation. She stated it as a simple matter of record, her voice devoid of pride or bluster. I know 17, it wasn't bragging. It was a statement of fact. A data point, the number hung in the air, and the galaxy's core miscalculations suddenly became painfully clear to everyone present. They had classified humans as newcomers, as soft, unevolved primates who had stumbled into the stars through luck. They judged based on physiology, the lack of natural claws, the absence of venom, the relatively soft skin. They saw the body and ignored the mind, the culture, the millennia of accumulated violence, and the methodology refined from it. They saw the tool, not the toolbox. The effect on the cubs was immediate and startling. They stopped their hesitant retreat. The low, confused chittering ceased. As one, the three predators straightened. Their heads, which had been lowered in uncertainty or pain, came up. Their bodies, which had been coiled defensively, settled into a rigid, formal posture. It was a stance of respect, of attention. They weren't looking at her as prey anymore, or even as a threat to be feared. They were looking at her as an authority. The death sport had ended. The spectacle was over. What was happening now was something entirely different. It was a demonstration lecture, and the entire amphitheater, krill cubs included, had become her students. The shift was absolute. The crack in the floor, the gagging cub, the redirected pounces. It all clicked into place not as a series of desperate defenses, but as a calculated pedagogical display. She hadn't been fighting for her life. She had been teaching a lesson. And the lesson was that the galaxy had drastically underestimated what it meant to be human. The arena footage became the most viewed stream in galactic history within a single cycle. Every diplomatic corps, military academy, and scientific collective pulled the recording, analyzing it frame by frame with a kind of obsessive intensity, usually reserved for supernova remnants or ancient pre-spaceflight ruins. They weren't watching for entertainment anymore. They were studying. The sheer volume of data traffic nearly crashed 3 separate interstellar relays. It was the first time a death sport broadcast had ever been reclassified as essential tactical intelligence. Krill leadership found itself drowning in a diplomatic firestorm they had never anticipated. Formal complaints poured in from a dozen collective bodies, each citing the event as a violation of interspecies ethical protocols they themselves had ignored for centuries. The methane ambassador, who had placed the largest wager, became a figure of ridicule overnight. His earlier smugness was replayed on loops across the hypernet, juxtaposed with the final silent moments of the match. The political pressure was immense and utterly humiliating. The guaranteed 45-second fatality statistic became a punchline. Memes circulated showing the number crossed out with a human bootprint. Military analysts from 100 species immediately began rewriting close-quarters engagement protocols. Manuals that had remained unchanged for generations were suddenly obsolete. The focus shifted from brute force and natural weaponry to redirection, neurological targeting, and kinetic efficiency. They weren't just studying a fight. They were dissecting a new philosophy of violence. Scientists entered a heated, system-wide debate that raged across academic channels. The central question was whether to reclassify humans as a predatory species or something entirely new. They didn't fit the existing categories. Their weapons weren't biological. They were methodological. Their strength wasn't innate. It was engineered through training. The very taxonomy of threat assessment had to be reconsidered. Were they predators or were they something else? A thinking adaptive variable that operated outside of established biological hierarchies. The entire betting apparatus for the krill arena had to be refunded. Not a single wager in the system had been placed on survival, let alone outright victory. The financial fallout was a bureaucratic nightmare of epic proportions. Commander Vexnar's smug assurance evaporated, replaced by a torrent of official inquiries and disciplinary reviews. His career didn't just stall. It imploded under the weight of his catastrophic miscalculation. He became a cautionary tale about underestimating the unknown. Amidst all the analysis and recrimination, one moment transcended the tactical breakdowns and found a life of its own. Jessica's careful, deliberate folding of her jacket became a galactic meme. It was clipped, isolated, and shared with captions that translated roughly to calm capability under extreme duress. It symbolized a mindset that was utterly alien to most of the galaxy, the ability to maintain mundane, almost domestic composure in the face of certain, horrific death. It was a quiet, powerful image that said more about humanity than any after-action report ever could. The statistical analysis was complete. The engagement protocols were being rewritten. The political fallout was still unfolding. That's when the Cubs did the unthinkable. The 3 juvenile predators, the focus of all this analysis and upheaval, ignored the stunned silence of the crowd and the blaring statistical displays. They moved away from the center of the arena, not to retreat to their holding pens, but to approach Jessica. It wasn't an attack posture. Their claws were retracted. Their heads were lowered. Their body language had shed every last vestige of aggression, replaced by a tentative, almost inquisitive demeanor. They were not approaching a foe. They were approaching her. The transition was so complete, so jarring, that it rendered the preceding minutes of violence somehow obsolete. The death arena had just become the site of a different kind of encounter entirely. The smallest cub was the first to move. the one she'd thrown into the wall at the start. It approached her slowly, its head lowered not in an attack posture but in clear, unmistakable submission. Its claws were fully retracted, its shoulders hunched. It moved with a tentative, almost shuffling gait that was completely alien to its species. The tension in the amphitheater cranked up again, but for a different reason. Every single spectator, from the methane-breathing ambassadors to the six-armed krill officers, expected her to finish them. It was arena tradition. Victory wasn't complete until the defeated were dismantled. It was the unspoken rule of the spectacle. The silence was heavy with the anticipation of final, brutal closure. Instead, Jessica did something that made no sense within the established framework of the event. She reached out but not to strike. Her hand went to the cub's head, her fingers finding a spot just behind its sensory horns. She scratched it. It was a gentle, repetitive motion, the kind a human uses to pet a dog. The crowd didn't murmur. They just stared, utterly baffled. The gesture was so domestic, so out of place, it was more shocking than any act of violence could have been. The cub didn't jerk away. It leaned into the touch. A low, rumbling vibration started deep in its chest. A contented purr that was picked up by the arena's sensitive audio pickups and broadcast to the stunned silence. It was a sound of pleasure, of comfort. The other two cubs, seeing this, immediately lost their hesitant postures. They shuffled forward not with aggression but with a kind of eager curiosity. They pushed their heads toward her, chittering softly, seeking the same contact. Their transformation was breathtakingly fast. In a matter of minutes, they had gone from engineered killing machines to emotional, almost needy beings, responsive to a simple act of physical affection. The fight had been a performance. This was the real show. Jessica didn't seem surprised. She explained it to the silent room as she continued to scratch behind their horns, her voice still calm and matter-of-fact. She said they had a pronounced sweet tooth, a particular fondness for human biscuits of all things. The word sounded absurd in that context. It was like discussing dessert recipes in a charnel house. The three predators, now apparently named Biscuit, Sergeant, and Whiskers in her mind, rubbed against her legs like oversized, lethal house cats, their earlier ferocity completely forgotten. They had been reclassified in her presence, their identities rewritten not as weapons but as individuals. The resolution was as surreal as the fight had been violent. Jessica turned and walked toward the human sector exit, the same door she'd entered through. The three krill cubs fell in behind her without a moment's hesitation, following her in a loose, obedient line. They didn't look back at their own kind. They didn't acknowledge the stunned krill elders or the silent crowd. The death arena, a place designed for the terminus of life, had just become an adoption center. She led them out, not as a conqueror with prisoners, but as someone heading home with three new, very large and unexpectedly loyal companions. The heavy door slid shut behind them, cutting off the view. That's when the Galactic Council's priority channel lit up my console, along with every other official terminal in the observation deck. The demand was immediate and frantic. They needed an explanation, not for the combat techniques, not for the physics of the throws. They needed a biological, psychological, diplomatic explanation for what they had just witnessed. How does a species bred for millennia to be the galaxy's perfect predators switch its entire behavioral programming in under 10 minutes because someone scratched behind its ears? The question wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about the fundamental nature of consciousness, domestication, and the unsettling flexibility of even the most hardwired instincts. The Council wasn't asking for a report. They were asking for a miracle of behavioral science to be explained before they had a full-scale interspecies incident on their hands. The Council's demand for an explanation crackled over the comms with a frantic, almost panicked energy. They weren't military analysts asking for a breakdown of the throws. This was different. They wanted to know if humans possessed some form of supernatural ability or hidden technological edge. One of the methane delegates suggested covert genetic modification. Another floated the theory of implanted nano-enhancements. The speculation was wild, born from a complete inability to process what they'd witnessed through any known biological framework. They were searching for a cheat code, a secret advantage that would let them slot humanity back into an understandable box. Jessica's response was characteristically dry and devoid of drama. She described human adrenal response not as magic, but as a standard biological enhancement system. She broke it down like an engineer explaining a piece of standard issue equipment. A hormone surge triggered under extreme stress, temporarily amplifying strength and suppressing pain signals. It was a survival mechanism, pure and simple, a built-in emergency protocol every human carried from birth. She was quick to point out this wasn't unique to her species. Many creatures across the galaxy have similar panic state overrides. The krill have their venom sacs that can inject a combative stimulant. The methane collective can consciously increase their internal pressure to withstand incredible force for short bursts. The difference, she explained, wasn't the hardware. It was the software. The training. For most species, these states are involuntary, triggered by panic or instinct. They're a last-ditch survival gambit, often with severe metabolic consequences afterward. Humanity had taken that basic panic-driven system and refined it through millennia of deliberate practice. They learned to control it, to access it consciously through disciplined mental conditioning and rigorous physical training. An officer like her didn't wait for fear to trigger the response. She could initiate it at will, modulate its intensity, and wield it with precision. It wasn't about losing control. It was about gaining it. The state that made other species stronger but dumber and more reckless was, for a trained human, a state of hyper-clarity and focused application. The strength boost was just a side effect. The real weapon was the calm. The phrase that ended the discussion became a standard diplomatic refrain across the galaxy. Not superhuman, she said, her tone flat and final. Just human. It was a simple, devastating correction that closed the door on 1,000 conspiracy theories. There was no secret, no hidden tech, just a species that had taken a common biological trait and, through sheer stubborn necessity, learned to engineer it into a tool. The council members fell silent, processing this. The idea that the most shocking aspect of the display was merely a refined version of a near-universal survival mechanism was somehow more disturbing than if it had been magic. It meant the potential was there, latent in a physiology they had dismissed as primitive. It meant they had drastically underestimated the power of training and culture over brute biology. That's when she delivered the final piece of the puzzle. The context that made the adrenaline control not just impressive but terrifying. She revealed that every Terran Coalition officer is required to be proficient in multiple combat systems. It wasn't an eccentricity of hers. It was standard doctrine. The calm in the arena, the precise application of force, the redirection. It all stemmed from a deep, diverse library of violent knowledge that was standard issue for their military. The galaxy had just witnessed not a unique talent, but a standard output of human training. The implications of that were far more vast and unsettling than any single display of power could ever be. The council members struggled to process the concept of learning multiple combat systems. You could see it on their faces, or whatever passed for faces among the methane breathers and silicate-based delegates. Their entire understanding of martial prowess was built on specialization. A species develops one devastating natural weapon, venom, claws, psychic pulses, and refines it over millennia. Or they master a single unified combat style that complements their physiology. The idea of collecting different ways to fight, like data points in a library, was alien to them. It seemed inefficient, unfocused. Jessica explained it without a hint of pride. Humans don't see fighting styles as finished products. They see them as evolving data sets. They're always adding, adapting, refining. A technique from one ancient culture gets merged with the principles of another. They strip away the ceremonial aspects, keep the effective core, and integrate it into a broader system. It's a process of constant, deliberate curation. They aren't loyal to any one method. They're loyal to results. She listed them off like she was reading a manifest. Muay Thai for powerful, close-range striking using every available limb as a weapon. Jiu-Jitsu for controlling an opponent on the ground through leverage and joint manipulation. Krav Maga for ruthless efficiency, prioritizing immediate incapacitation over form or tradition. Each system was developed for a specific set of circumstances, a particular type of opponent or environment. They weren't interchangeable. They were tools for specific jobs. This diversity created a tactical advantage the galaxy had never considered: unpredictability. A specialist, no matter how deadly, is predictable. Their movements follow a pattern. Their strategies are built around their one overwhelming strength. A krill always leads with its claws. A methane collective fighter always uses pressure differentials. You can train for that. You can develop counters. But how do you train to fight someone who might switch from a grappling hold to a precision elbow strike to a throws? You learned from a completely different planetary culture, all within 3 seconds. The human fighter isn't a master of one thing. They are a competent practitioner of many, and that versatility makes them impossible to categorize and therefore impossible to reliably counter. The requirement for a Terran Coalition officer is a minimum of 3 systems. But as Jessica noted dryly, most exceed that substantially. It's not seen as exceptional. It's seen as due diligence. The 17 systems she knew weren't a boast. They were a reflection of a cultural obsession with being prepared for any conceivable violent encounter. The galaxy's realization was slow and deeply unsettling. They hadn't been watching a master of a singular art. They'd been watching a generalist, a jack-of-all-trades who had just schooled 3 biological specialists at their own game. The hum wasn't just about her skill. It was about the terrifying implication that this level of diversified competence might be standard for her entire species. The resolution settled over the council chamber, not as a shock, but as a cold, dawning comprehension. The human advantage wasn't strength or speed. It was options. It was a deep, varied library of violence that they could draw from at will, ensuring they were never without a tool for the job. They weren't the biggest or the strongest in any one category. They were just competent in enough categories to never be truly outmatched. That's when Jessica leaned forward slightly, her calm demeanor never shifting, and began to share her personal philosophy on the relationship between self-defense and diplomacy. It wasn't a prepared speech. It was a statement of principle, delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used to describe elbow strikes and adrenal control. She was about to connect the violence they had just witnessed to the art of negotiation, and the room fell utterly silent again, waiting for the connection to be made. She mentioned the table incident like it was a minor point of diplomatic etiquette. A footnote. She'd been in preliminary talks with a methane collective ambassador, one of those gaseous beings who consider solid-based life forms inherently primitive. The negotiation was standard: resource allocation, transit rights. The usual bureaucratic dance. The tension started when the ambassador, in that condescending vibrational language they use, openly questioned human intelligence. He didn't just disagree with a term. He suggested the entire species was backward, a flash-in-the-pan civilization that had gotten lucky with faster-than-light travel and would soon collapse under its own incompetence. He said this while floating there, a contained cloud of smug superiority, dismissing centuries of human history and achievement. Jessica listened. She didn't interrupt. She let him finish his entire spiel. Then she stood up. The galaxy in that moment expected one of 2 things: either abject submission, the silent acceptance of an insult to avoid conflict, or lethal, overwhelming force. A drawn weapon, a declaration of war. Those were the established protocols. What they got was neither. She moved to the side of the conference table. It was a standard-issue diplomatic piece, heavy polished durasteel. She didn't look at the ambassador. She placed her hand on the table's edge. Then, in one smooth, controlled motion, she introduced the ambassador's containment field, the closest thing he had to a face, to the sharp corner of that table. The impact wasn't a violent smash. It was a precise, sharp crack of energy against metal. The sound echoed in the quiet room. The ambassador's form flickered violently, his gaseous composition compressing and swirling in shocked disarray. The act wasn't aggression. It was communication. A single, unequivocal statement. It was boundary enforcement. She wasn't trying to hurt him. The containment field was too strong for that. She was making a point. Self-defense in human terms isn't just about protecting your physical body. It includes defending your dignity, your intellectual respect, your right to be at the table without being treated like a curious animal. The galaxy's binary expectation of either total passivity or total war completely failed to account for this third option, a calibrated, proportional response designed not to destroy, but to educate. A lesson delivered with physics instead of words. This quickly became the human diplomatic signature. Measured, unequivocal. They wouldn't start a fight, but they would absolutely end a disrespectful conversation with a tangible demonstration of consequences. It was a language every species, no matter how alien, could understand. The resolution was as effective as it was unsettling. The Methane Collective ambassador did not file a formal complaint. He did not threaten retaliation. He spent a few minutes stabilizing his form, the vibrations of his body shifting from outraged to contemplative. When the talks resumed, his manner was completely different. He negotiated with improved manners. A newfound cautious respect underpinned every proposal. The insulting vibrations stopped. The condescension vanished. He had learned in the most direct way possible that human politeness was a choice, not a weakness. That's when the real work began behind the scenes. The incident report was circulated, analyzed, and debated at the highest levels of the Galactic Council. They weren't just looking at combat metrics or adrenal responses anymore. They were looking at a fundamentally new approach to interspecies relations. They began the long, arduous process of reclassifying humanity's threat category. The old designation of emerging species low to moderate threat was immediately scrapped. It was useless. They weren't dealing with a predictable military power. They were dealing with a culture that considered a calibrated shove against a table to be a valid form of diplomatic dialogue. The new classification was debated for weeks. It wasn't about firepower or fleet size. It was about philosophy. The category they eventually settled on translated roughly to variable response capability, high. It was a dry, bureaucratic phrase that hid a world of terrifying implications. It meant humanity couldn't be predicted. It meant they always had options. And it meant the galaxy needed to mind its manners.